Good morning. The reason I'm here today is to attempt to change the way you value education, the way you look at education. Because, believe it or not, the way you look at education is going to affect you in a few short years when you go into college. I'm going to explain a few things about college to you that you might not know, and I'm going to explain it through examples. You might be thinking, well, what kind of examples? I'm going to talk to you about college with my personal experiences in college. Now, I've had quite a few experiences in college. I've got several master's degrees. I have gone to college during the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and even in the 2000s. So I've got a lot of college behind me, and that is what I feel qualifies me to give you the information I'm about to give you about college. I'm going to start with the 60s. Even though I wasn't in college in the 60s, I did kind of pick up on it from older brothers and sisters that I had. For example, during the 60s, during the decade of the 60s, professors in colleges, they gave out considerably more A grades of A, than as compared to as they do today. And some of the courses were courses that we do not have on the college rosters today. For example, there was a course called Philosophy 101. Now, in Philosophy 101, there was a final exam. The final exam was one word. Why? Question mark. A student answers that question with one word, because, period. The student's grade, an A. Now mind you, in college, the professor is only going to look at 2 papers throughout the semester that you're in that class. He will look at a midterm exam, he will look at a final exam. Both of them are worth about 50% of your grade. Well, during the decade of the 60s, when all these professors were giving out all these grades of A to students, of course these students graduated, and the employers, when they were looking at the graduates, well, employers like to take the top 20% of the class and hire them. Unfortunately, because there were so many A's that were being given out, these employees just were not working out. So, what happened during the 70s, the employers, and this happened over a period of a decade during the 70s throughout the country, the employers went over to the local colleges and spoke to the administration. The employers basically said, hey, your professors are giving out way too many A's. You've got to start giving out more B's and C's. So, what happens? The administration, they have a little talk with their professors, and they say to the professors, look guys, you've got to start giving out more B's, more C's. One math professor piped up, he said, well, I don't see a problem here. I have a 25-question test. It's a 2-hour-long test. I give the test to my students. My students do well on it. I did my job. I taught the material. They showed me through their knowledge, their grades, that they have learned the material. What's the problem? Well, the administrator said to him, well, you're going to make one change in what you just told me. Instead of giving a 25-question test in your 2-hour time period, you are now going to give a 50-question test in the same 2-hour time period. Well, in doing so, now you had the standard normal curve this many A's, this many B's, this many C's, this many D's, and you know the rest. So, compared to the 1960s, the 1970s just became a little bit more difficult. Now, during the 1970s, by the way, I still remember the class. It was in the fall semester of 1973, my first semester in college. And I walk into my first midterm exam. It was a math exam. I sat down to do the test. The professor said, "This is all I have for you. It's a 2-hour test. When you are finished with your exam, bring it up, put it on my desk, and you can leave. That's all I have for you today." Well, after 1 hour, about an hour, one of the students behind me comes walking down the road with his test paper in hand. He's going up to the professor. I'm thinking he must have received a bad copy. He can't read the numbers. Well, this student walked up to the professor's desk, put the paper down on his desk. He went out the door. I remember thinking, I'm in trouble. If a student is going to finish a test in 1 hour, a 2-hour test in 1 hour, and I'm nowhere near halfway done, I'm in trouble. Anyway, by the way, nobody else finished the test early. The next class period, the professor walks in the room. He walked up to the student's desk, put the paper down on his desk. He said, "Congratulations, you're the only one that got an A." There were no B's. I believe there were 4 C's. I wasn't one of them. And the rest, well, you know the rest, okay, where those grades were. In any case, when I left that classroom that day, then I really started having second thoughts about, am I ever going to graduate? What is my competition like here? How did that one student finish the test in 1 hour when nobody else did? Well, through the years, I forgot about it because I just couldn't do anything about it. Did my best. Let me talk about the 80s. In the 1980s, they did something that personally, the administration, the colleges, did something that personally cost me over $1,000. What they did, even though the grading scale for the previous 100 years at that college was, and you recognize this, A, B, C, D, during the 80s, they made one change to this. For me, it was 1984. The classes began in January. They ended around May. They changed the grading system. They added these little marks, pluses and minuses. Now, at the time, I was trying to get into one of my master's programs, and they told me, well, you have these 30 credits that you have to take to get into the program, and you have to get a B or better. All right? Well, when I first saw my grade, I saw the B, and I thought, I made it because it was a tough course. But there was a little mark next to the B, and it wasn't a plus. It was a minus. Well, that B minus was not good enough. I had to retake that course. So, the tuition for that 3-credit graduate course alone was $1,000. I had a different professor, so I had to get another book. And what really upset me was the fact that, mind you, at this time I was teaching classes during the day, going to night school, and every Tuesday and Thursday night between 6:30 and 9:30, I had to drive about 11 miles over to the local college, park the car, run into class. That whole semester was wasted because of that minus sign. During the 1980s, colleges just became a little bit more difficult, as they were in the 70s. As each decade progresses during my talk, I'm going to show you and tell you how colleges became more difficult. Also, during the 1980s, what happened is a lot of the manufacturing companies in the US started locking their doors. What that meant is high school graduates could no longer go out after high school and find a good paying job. Their choices, money-wise, were greatly diminished. So what happened during the 1990s? More and more colleges are hearing this. I'll do that again. This is what the colleges are hearing. What is that? That is you. That is high school students that are knocking on the doors to get into the colleges. Well, the colleges looked at this great influx of students, so what did they start doing? They started increasing their ACT score requirements. They started increasing their SAT score requirements. In the 90s, students found it more and more difficult to get into college. Now, one thing about colleges that you may want to investigate, you may want to Google the college that you plan on going to. What you want to look at specifically is day one, year one of classes, and day one, year two of classes. There is a considerable drop-off between day one, year one, and day one, year two. And that drop-off is because students cannot return to the college that they were at during their first year because of low grade point averages. I'll give you an example. In part because of that one first midterm exam that I took, my score was a 50-something. My first semester in college back in the 70s, my grade point average was like 2.078 on a 4-point scale, 4.0 being the top. I received a letter, and the letter stated, if I fall below a 2.0 scale for my grade point average during semester 2 of my first year, I cannot return. That's something that really shook me up, and I made that first year, I made it through by the skin of my teeth. Quite honestly, if I was sitting in the chair you're sitting in today, looking at entering college, I don't think I could make it, not with the knowledge that I had. You see, colleges are getting more and more difficult. Now, remember I said in the 80s, the factories here in this country started to close the manufacturing facilities? A lot of those jobs went overseas. Well, what's happening overseas in this time period? The standard of living for third world countries, China, India, that's starting to rise. And with that, the U.S. is seeing an increase, an influx of foreign students coming into this country for college. So now, not only do you have to compete against your peers that you grew up with, your local population, you now have to compete with a population that consists of the planet. We start getting more students from Japan, South Korea, Egypt, India, China. And interestingly enough, the colleges are noticing a disturbing trend. The students that were homeschooled in the USA, they're dropping out like flies during the 90s. The foreign students, not so much so. Well, the administration at the colleges starts talking to the high schools. High schools, you've got to do something. The students from the high schools in the US just are not making it in the college, at the college level. What happens during the 90s? It took about a decade. AP classes. Today we have AP classes in many courses. When I graduated back in the 70s, there were no AP classes. But we're trying to keep up with the competition that we have coming from overseas. Now let me give you an example of how competition from the overseas is different from competition, your local competition that you have here. This was actually explained to me very clearly by a teacher that I was speaking to. There was a teacher exchange program. A teacher in China came to teach here in one of our schools for 1 year, and the teacher that was teaching here went to teach in China. They switched classes for 1 year. And as I was speaking to this teacher from China, I asked, say, what is the biggest difference that you notice, say, in this country compared to your country back home? She said, well, first off, the biggest difference I notice here in this country is the tremendous wealth. I mean, I look out the window here, I see people driving around in their cars. I look out the window in my city in China, I see people pedaling bicycles. Then she pointed to the classroom. She said, look at this classroom. Look at the tremendous wealth in this classroom. She pointed to the whiteboards. She said, wait, whiteboards. In my classroom, I have the chalkboards, the old-time boards with chalk. Look at the lights. Well, I knew what she was talking about, lights, okay? Now you look at the lights, you're probably thinking, yeah, I'm looking at the lights, what about them? Well, what you may not know is that in this country there's a federal law. You can take a desk, put it in any corner of the 4 corners of the room. It had better have 125 candle power lighting coming to it. That's a measurement of a unit of light. She said, you know, in my classroom in China, I have 4 incandescent light bulbs. They're the ones with the filament inside. And if it burns out, I don't necessarily get one the next day or the next week. She walked up to a bookcase. She took a book off the bookcase. She showed me the book. She said, look at this book. It is 2 years old. This book is in worse condition at 2 years old than my algebra books for my students are in China, and those books are 17 years old. By the way, I've got 34 students, 17 books. 1 book, 2 students. They have to share. Now, in a way, I've got to say, it's not your fault. You just happen to be born in a country where there's a law that says each and every one of you has to be in that chair until you're 18 years of age. 16 years with some strict work-related privileges. Not all countries can afford to educate their young ones. That teacher continued to point around the room. She pointed to the laptop. She said, we don't have any laptops. She pointed to the computer on the desk. We don't have any computers. She just went on and on. She opened up a shelf in the room with, it was just stacked from end to end with books. She said, we don't have any shelves full of books in our school. She said to me was, you know, when I crossed the threshold to my classroom in China, if there's any talking going on, it automatically stops as soon as my foot enters the room. I can walk up to the blackboard in my room, the chalkboard, I can start my lesson 10 to 15 seconds after I enter the room. Here in this country, sometimes I have to wait 10 to 15 minutes for the class to settle down. I came across something that I'd like to show you on the board here that can bring across the point that I'm trying to show you, explain to you. And we should have it up and running. Computer died, okay. As soon as the computer wakes up. Now what you're going to see here in this clip, the person is speaking a different language. It does not matter that you can or cannot understand her. It's actually, I believe it's South Korea.
ข้อหนึ่งสามารถเข้าถึงประชาชนได้ทุกจุดนะคะไม่ว่าจะอยู่ต่างจังหวัดหรือว่าที่ใดในกรุงเทพหรือต่างจังหวัดเราก็สามารถรับฟังวิทยุได้ราคาถูกสร้างความสนุกสนานเพลิดเพลินเพราะว่าเดี๋ยวนี้ดีเจจะทำหน้าที่ให้เราเนี่ยได้อยากฟังวิทยุมากขึ้นพูดรับได้อย่างรวดเร็วหมายความว่าไงหมายความว่าอะไรนะคะผู้รับหรือผู้ฟังมีความรู้สึกใกล้ชิด
Now you will notice when she took that student's iPhone for taking a call during her lecture, right after that iPhone hit the floor, right after she smashed the iPhone into a million pieces, there was not one sound that was uttered by the class. Now granted, I will admit that that is on one far end of the extreme as far as what one might consider acceptable. But what I wanted you to, the takeaway that I wanted you to get from that was the fact that the students were quiet before and after she broke the iPhone. If I would have done the same thing in this country, there would have been a big whoopla uprising with respect to the students sitting in the classroom. But in other countries, teachers, they are respected considerably more than they are in this country. As comparison, granted that film strip showed one end of an extreme. In this country, you may not know it, but we're way on this other end of the extreme as far as how we value education, how we value educators. Anyhow, continuing with my talk, 2013, I happened to be in one of those classes that your teachers attend every now and then, professional development classes, where we learn ourselves the magic that helps you learn better. We learn to teach you better. And remember that one student that I was telling you about back in the 70s in my math class that passed the test, or that was the only A in the classroom? I actually got my answer 4 decades later. 40 years later, I figured out how and why he got the only A in the classroom. It was during this in-service session that I was sitting at that I became aware of a study that was done in 2005 What happened in 2005 is there were 3 doctoral students. They were PhD students. They were studying for their doctorate. Now, when you get your doctorate degree, you have to write a dissertation, basically a book. And these 3 students got together and they tried to figure out, why is it that students from other countries, when they come to our colleges, beat the pants off of our our college students who were educated in the good old USA? There's a difference. Something is causing that considerable drop-off between day 1, year 1, day 1, year 2. So, they decided to look at algebra classes. They looked at algebra classes in Japan. They looked at algebra classes here in the US. They found that in Japan, if a student has difficulty with a math problem, on average, it takes that student 3 days before they come up to the teacher and ask the teacher, how do you do this problem? I'm having trouble with it. I don't understand it. They looked at hundreds of classes here in the USA, hundreds of algebra classes. They found, on average, here in the USA, it takes the average student 37 seconds to ask, how do you do that problem? I don't understand how to do this problem I'm working on here. 37 seconds, 3 days. That's when I got my answer 40 years later about how that student back in the 70s got the only A in the class. That's when it dawned on me. That happened to be the only foreign student in the classroom that was educated outside of the US. Now, one thing about college. If there is one grade that deserves an A, usually it's about 92 to 100, the professor will give an A. However, by comparison, there was one college graduate class that I was in during the 80s, and the highest grade on the midterm was a 67. There were no grades higher than a 67% in the whole class, because no one got a score in the 90s. That 67 was an A. Professors in the college level will grade on a curve, if nobody gets a grade that's in the 90s. In this case, there were no grades in the 80s, there were no grades in the 70s. The 67 was the most difficult grade. Well, as you guessed it, each and every one of those students in that classroom at the time, each and every one of those students was homegrown. Here in the USA, there were no foreign students in that classroom. I got lucky that time. How is it different today? Let me share one more experience with you. The year was August 2015. A friend of mine, his kid is going to college. Because I've got the minivan with no back seats in it, the mattress, dresser, and a few other furniture items ended up in the back of my minivan. We're driving up to the University of Indiana in Bloomington, Indiana. After we set up the student to be in the apartment, I suggested that we go out and eat at the location where a lot of students hang out and eat. We went to a pizza place. As we're waiting for our pizza, I'm looking around the restaurant and I notice there appear to be a lot of foreign students. I asked the student to be, say, I notice a lot of foreign students at this university, University of Indiana in Bloomington, Indiana. My question was, how many foreign students are at this school anyway? The answer I got surprised me. Well, 30 to 35% of the students here come from China. The other 30 to 35% of the students come from other places around the planet. Egypt, South Korea, India, Japan. We, the Americans, are actually the minority at this college. Your competition today, that's what it's like. There's many more foreign students. I was lucky. I had one foreign student in the class back in the 70s when I attended college, that math exam, midterm. Honestly, if I was going to the University of Indiana in Bloomington, Indiana today, I would not be here. One more thing that kind of surprises me. When I was your age, admittedly, my diet was not the best. I mean, I used to love those Mickey D quarter pounder with cheese, etc., etc., etc. Well, after eating quarter pounders with cheeses in my 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and this happens to a lot of older people my age, once you get to the 60s, problems start occurring. And on November 2nd of 2016, I find myself being rolled into the operating room up the road there on Crimson Road, the heart hospital. They had to unplug my arteries. I still remember when they rolled me into the operating room. Sometimes, usually you're under when they roll you in there, but for whatever reason, the anesthesiologist was running a little late. So I was still conscious when they rolled me in. Interestingly enough, I'm cracking jokes with the people that are assisting with the surgery. I noticed there were 18 people that were assisting with the surgery. Interestingly enough, all of those 18 people that were assisting with that surgery, they were homegrown. They were all educated here in the States. I could tell by their accent and whatnot. They didn't have one. The reason I'm standing in front of you today, the reason I'm alive, because of the surgeon that did that surgery. One thing about that surgeon, I had a hard time understanding him. He was from India, a very heavy accent. Interesting. The top dog in the surgery room, educated elsewhere. By the way, the next time you go into a hospital for whatever reason to visit somebody or just going in for a checkup, you might want to check the roster where they have the doctors' names listed. You're not going to have as many Andersons and Smiths on that roster. You will have a lot more foreign-sounding names. Interestingly enough, in college, you will also have foreign-sounding names. One of the biggest complaints I hear about college students is, I have difficulty understanding my professor. They have such a thick accent. Also, oddly enough, you do not have, or perhaps have not had, many foreign teachers. You know, while you're going to school in grades kindergarten through 12. Many of the foreign teachers that start teaching in the public schools here in the States, they don't last long. Some of them last 1 or 2 weeks, and they leave because of the respect that they get here in this country compared to other countries. Now, having said all this about your competition in college, at the end of one of my talks, one young lady raised her hand and asked, I have dyslexia. Does that mean I cannot go to college? I do want to leave you with this disclaimer. If you have any type of disability, there is the American with Disabilities Act. Oddly enough, a lot of your foreign professors in the colleges are not aware of that act. I'll give you an example. 2 weeks before final exams, my niece decides to go skiing with friends while she was going to college. Slippery roads, car accident. She ends up in a car accident, and her arm, from her shoulder to her fingers, is in a cast. She showed up 10 days before her finals, and she was concerned about the final exams. Her professors said to her, well, I guess you'll have to retake the courses next semester. Come back when you can write your final exam. She called me very upset, and I explained to her, I said, no, it's called the American with Disabilities Act. You need to go to the dean of the department and say, Americans with Disabilities Act, point to your cast. Each professor was required to give her an alternative test because she could not write it. By alternative, I don't mean that the questions were different. It was just the presentation, the form. In this case, she had to take the test with the professor. Each professor sat her down. The professor had to read the questions, and if the answer was A, B, C, D on a Scantron, the professor had to fill in A, B, C, D. If it was an essay answer, the professor either had to listen to what she was saying, or write down what she was saying, or tape record what she was saying, and she ended up getting a 3.9 grade point average on a 4.0 top that semester. So if you do have a disability, colleges are required by law to meet that disability in any shape, way, or form that they can do that. A lot of the professors that come from other countries do not have our equivalent of an American with Disabilities Act. For example, I had a friend who was traveling in Hong Kong, and what happened is one person dropped down to the ground and started shaking. They were having an epilepsy. They had epilepsy. They were having an epileptic attack. Interestingly enough, people in other countries, they're not aware of what's going on. That area there where that person was having an attack on the sidewalk, it cleared out by a city block. Whoever was there just ran away. Other countries, they do not have the knowledge that we have here about physical ailments. And for us here, we're more aware of things like that, but the professors that come here and teach at the colleges, a lot of them might not be aware of the American with Disabilities Act, and that's just something that I want you to inform you of, should any of you have dyslexia or have any other disabilities. Having said that, are there any questions? Thank you for coming.